To begin with, for various reasons, this morning I would really like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their custodianship of this land that we are meeting on today, and what beautiful land it is. We also acknowledge all of the Indigenous people that are here with us today, and people that are attending the festival from Indigenous nations all over the world. The panel today aims to explore these three writers and their books and the influence the landscape of Australia, and in fact landscape generally, has on its inhabitants. Each one of them takes a very different perspective, and whilst two of the books touch on Indigenous issues and places and people, the panel today want to acknowledge that we don't have an Indigenous voice up here with us, and that we actually acknowledge and realise that there's tens of thousands of years of contact with the land, and they would be able to speak very differently about the way the land speaks to them. But we will be touching on some of the Indigenous history and issues today. So please let me introduce our three panellists here today. First, right next to me here is Ian Hoskins. Ian is a historian and an academic, a curator, and currently he's North Sydney Council historian. He's the author of a book called Sydney Harbour, which won the Queensland Premier's Literary Award, and now this beautiful looking book here, Coast, with all my little sticky notes in it, A History of the New South Wales Edge. Next to him is Kathryn Heyman, who many of you will know. She's an internationally awarded author of 5 novels, and including a nomination for the very prestigious Orange Prize. Her most recent work is Floodlines, and if I was trying to sum it up, I'd say it was an exploration of human behaviour in crisis, I imagine, but it's very much about the landscape, a work of fiction, obviously. And to the end is Malcolm Knox. Many of you will recognise Malcolm, former literary editor and cricket writer of great fame for the Sydney Morning Herald, and again, a highly awarded writer of 2 novels and many non-fiction titles, including Boom, this latest one, The Underground History of Australia from Gold Rush to GFC. And the greatest thing about being a chair is you get to read 3 what would seem very different books and actually link them together, and it's a wonderful journey to read 3 books like that and try and find the links and find that there are so many that Gemma obviously found when she programmed this. So my first question to you all really is going to be about the impact of the land on who we are. That's really the crux of this session. How does it affect us as human beings? What does it do in terms of our behaviour, our politics, our economy? We're going to talk about all of these things today. So how does the land impact on who we are? And I'm going to start with you, Ian. The beautiful Max de Payne, the Sun Baker photograph that most of you will recognise, that gorgeous image. It's photographed in the book. Can you start with the notion of the coast, as that seems to be the quintessential Australian image, if you like, when we think of ourselves. Has that always been true of our image of ourselves, or is it a contemporary image? Would you like to talk and start with that?
Sure. Well, you might think it has been forever true, but the backstory of the photograph, the Sunbaker, is a fascinating one, and I knew I wanted to use that photograph in the book because of the backstory, because it was taken in 1935 on the South Coast, a holiday down the South Coast, and it never actually made it into print beyond the negative stage until I think it was 1977, when the Australian Centre for Photography opened in Paddington, and the curator saw it and said, that's the one, that's what it means to be Australian. Max hadn't paid it too much attention. He had another very similar one that was printed, but not much to do made about it. So by 1977, we were quintessentially a beach-going, sun-bronzed people in our own minds anyway, white Australians, unequivocally. In 1935, we were well on the way to that, but 50 years earlier, we were nowhere near that. And that was the interesting transition that I was trying to chart in the book. And I make the point with that photograph, I expect most of you can imagine it in your minds as just a head and shoulders on the sand, and there's the water beating on the shoulders. I make the point that if that had been taken, say, 70 years earlier, and there were cameras around 70 years earlier, and Australians looked at it, it would be of a shipwrecked sailor on the beach. That's what it was, because we weren't worshipping the beach. We were avoiding beaches to a large extent, and we were swimming. We were a swimming people, but we were very much an English swimming people in still water, in sort of pools carved out of rock shelves or pools in harbours, and that was the shift, a very late, recent shift, and that's what I found so interesting.
So the coast was our first point of contact for white settlers, and we looked at it from afar, and then we finally came onto that coast. And just in terms of the impact of that land, what was the impact when the first settlers saw that coast and that land? What was their thinking? Where did they?
Well, they were thinking about what was inside the coast. That was so powerful. What is inside this land? So it was an interior focus from the beginning, right through until the 20th century, in my mind. And the coast, official exploration of the coast was very piecemeal. When Matthew Flinders rolled up in 1796, he said, we've hardly looked at anything. They'd explored Botany Bay, Port Hacking, and that was that, because it was a penal colony. And there was not much point going beyond that. We had, the British, that is, had claimed New South Wales, which was only half the continent. The other half was New Holland, and the Dutch could claim that if they wanted. But the emphasis was what is in there. What is beyond the mountains? Is there wealth? And that's the focus. So exploration, interestingly enough, was haphazard and serendipitous, because it was convicts who were stealing a boat in the harbour and hightailing it up the coast and ending up at Port Stephens, living there for 3 years, only to be captured and taken back to Sydney. They're the ones who are exploring the coast. They're extraordinary accounts. And the Richmond River, when Henry Rouse discovers, in inverted commas, the Richmond River, I think it's 1828, what does he see on the foreshore of the river but naked white men? And they're escaped convicts from Moreton Bay who have hung out with the Bundjalung people. So they knew about the local area, but the official understanding was lagging. And that says something about our attitude to the coast as opposed to the interior. We're very much focused on that. And the mythology, therefore, and the identity that develops through the 19th century is reflective of that. Very little literature about the coast in the 19th century. Very little artwork, in fact. Yep.
Which is interesting, yeah, and we'll hopefully have time to come back to some of that a bit later. Kathryn, in a way, your book could be set anywhere. The impact, though, of that land on the people and the way they behaved is very obvious and very strong in the reading of that novel. But my guess is that for you as a writer, that the impact of Australia has been very big on the way you have written. And in fact, you've lived a long time overseas, and I think all 5 of your novels have been set here, is that correct?
Yeah.
And I'd like to just explore that notion and the impact of the land on you personally and how you then bring that into your literature.
Yeah. I fiction writers have the conversation fairly frequently about, who is our muse, or, that idea of the muse. And I spent really a lot of my adult life and my young adult life outside of Australia. And my first novels were written very much from this sense of almost a physical longing for the landscape. And it wasn't for the culture, it wasn't for the people. No one from my family's in the audience today.
Sure.
It was very... Mum, you might want to... it was very much to do with the landscape and this sense of, the colours of the rock, the space. And actually, although I am a water baby, it was not the coast. It was this sort of sense of the interior, the landscapes that had kind of haunted me somehow. Often from the Northern Territory. And my first novel was very much and very consciously a novel of where the Australia of that novel was Aboriginal place names. It's a real place. It's all Bullaroo and Wabakal and Taralba, and very much not English or American names. It was very much a landscape of parched grass and industry. And when I came back to Australia after many years away, I found, unsurprisingly, that the landscape that had been physically sort of compelling me and serving as a kind of muse. I couldn't not write Australia. That it was a fictional landscape, that I had imagined and idealised my Australia. And of course it was drawn from my childhood, from a particular set of memories. But in fact, the Australia I returned to was a kind of what I think of as an Austramerica. And so that idea that what I mean by that is that I felt that there was a way of living in this country and in this landscape where you're not impacted at all by the physicality, by the space, by the light, by the rocks, where you're just on ring roads, hopping from KFC to McDonald's, with green motorway signs, that the landscape could be neutralised. And so that Austramerica really consciously became the setting for Floodline, which is the second novel I've written since living in Australia. So it's interesting that there has definitely been a shift in how I write about the physicality of the place. But it did begin as a road story. I met many years ago, I was performing in Edinburgh, and I met a group of 7 sisters who had all been homeschooled because their parents had come home one day and said, we've given away all our possessions, kids, and we're going to drive around Australia anti-clockwise because God told us to. Which, it's rational.
Why not?
It's as rational as my parenting philosophy. But that idea of, that the landscape became their backyard. I mean, one of the sisters said, the whole of Australia was my backyard. But also that the idea of being essentially a victim of someone else's faith. So I began to, that had sort of sat in me for quite a long time. But this novel is the story of a road trip to a flooded city. So of course it's about landscape that disappears, landscape that changes. And for me, that idea of, when you are so formed by the landscape, as I believe we are, I think our languages, our rhythms, the way we inhabit space, the sense that, I spent years in Oxford kind of smacking people because I'm like that, I'm Australian, we have lots of space. So, whereas actually everything there was about being contained and even verbally sort of held back and sucked in. And it's room instead of room, because I've got room to say room. It's all of that. But actually, if your landscape becomes absent, what do you do with that? How does that form you, both metaphorically and literally? So that became the sort of starting point for me.
Actually, someone quite glowingly compares the book to The Road, Cormac
was really flattered by that comparison. Yeah,
which is a really lovely thing. But it is in the sense that it could be anywhere at any time. It's a very global novel, but it was interesting that I couldn't help but place myself in Brisbane in tropical landscape. I just had to put myself there. And yet I think it was inspired by New Orleans, wasn't it?
Well, yes and no. Yeah. I mean, of course, Katrina had already happened, but I started writing the novel in 2009. And it was very much a mythologised flood because I wanted this idea of human worth and rescue and, the religious element, that it was sort of fable. But then, of course, in 2010, the Queensland floods happened. My sister was a nurse in Brisbane who had been on emergency call for days. So actually that kind of then came into it. And after that, I started to think about the connection with New Orleans. So, yeah, it has been read very much as the Queensland floods, and American fans read it as...
And we may come back to that later. I mean, it's really interesting when you do see the way impacts on the landscape, things like floods, make people behave quite differently to the way they would otherwise. You see all that volunteerism and community spirit. So we may come back to that later. Malcolm, you talk about mining and as if it's a part of our DNA in your introduction as Australians. And many of us would love to dispute that. Oh no, that couldn't be possibly true. How could that be true? Could you talk to that and explain to us about that?
In some cases, it's literally so. The population explosion of the Australian colonies during the gold rushes was unparalleled. You know, no country in the world has grown percentage-wise that quickly. And many of us here, including myself, would be in one way or another literally descendants of those gold settlers. I had well, in fact, I didn't know this when I was writing the book. I found out from my aunt Elspeth later, which was very handy for her to tell me later. But my great-great-grandfather was a gold seeker who arrived in Melbourne. Apprehended Australia through the coastline at Port Phillip Bay. In 1852, headed straight for the inland for the Ballarat diggings, spent the next 40 years following a different kind of anti-clockwise sweep around Australia, chasing gold up through New South Wales, through Queensland, across the Northern Territory and into Western Australia for the last great Australian gold rush, as did many others. And, that's one sense in the metaphorically, you could say that Australia was created by those gold rushes, and hence it is in our DNA. The other way of answering the question is, when you talk about DNA as a literary figure, you're thinking of things that are beneath the surface and yet to be discovered. And it's always been a fact of Australian life, as you confess yourself to be, if not ambivalent, then hostile towards what mining does. And when we're talking landscape, the miner views the landscape as a resource, and probably like my great-great-grandfather, looked out into the trees around Ballarat and thought, well, what's underneath there? What can I take out of there? And how can I enrich myself from this land? That dual-sided nature, our heritage is, it permeates Australia in lots of ways we could talk about at length, but one good story to illustrate that would be in the case of a West Australian Premier around the turn of around Federation time, who was a pastoralist, and he was asked, once gold had been discovered in Western Australia, and gold had pretty much saved Western Australia from extinction, as it had saved Queensland from extinction, and probably Tasmania from extinction, all in the post-convict era. He was asked, well, why didn't you find it? Why didn't you see it? And he said, well, my eyes were on the rolling fields beyond, not on the dirt beneath my feet. And the pastoral families of Western Australia were the upper class. Of course, the great nephew of that man, his name was John Forrest, and he was the Premier of Western Australia and the Treasurer of the Commonwealth. His great nephew is, the third force in mining today, and there you have a case of literally DNA passing through generations. To just take us back to the discussion that we're all having, landscape as resource is probably where our three books meet, and I think when I hear Ian talking, in particular, what jumped into my mind was in the 1950s up in Queensland, the Gulf of Carpentaria, a representative of what was then CRA, forerunner of the Rio Tinto company, called Harry Evans, who was a prospect. He beheld the coastline that would gladden the heart of a man such as himself. He was led there by an Aboriginal man whose name has gone down in history as Matthew, which is very typical of the way history has been written. And what Matthew led Harry Evans to were the bauxite cliffs of Weipa. And this, you know, what in many ways you could say is a beautiful, beautiful coastline, you know, orange cliffs spilling down into that turquoise sea of the Gulf. But of course, for Harry Evans, what it meant was, you know, untold development for Australia. Not for himself; he wasn't, you know, a prospector in that sense. But here's where you get that, you know, that the core of our ambivalence about mining, that beauty itself, and the beauty of how to apprehend a landscape can mean so many different things to different eyes. And you know, certainly there have been eyes that have ended up being the eyes of those who've made Australia, who saw beauty in that particular way.
And, you know, you talk about, I suppose, the way that we use the landscape and the way we see it with different eyes. I took quotes from both of your books, actually. We want to move on, I suppose, to the way we impact on the land. And I guess one of the things is, as Australians, we tend to romanticise, you know, the landscape, and we think we're all so connected to it and in part. But in the main, we seem to just look at ways of exploiting it. And I mean, that's what you've been talking about. And so I think there was a quote from your book that you might like to talk to, Ian, about, you know, it started, the buck's the thing. Okay, sorry, no, your one it's the wrong one. That comes from yours, Malcolm. That's right. The buck's the thing is actually the last line of a poem, isn't it, by Judith Wright about mining? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then at the same time I was reading that, you know, we found that another line in Ian's book that talked about for the sake of getting rich quickly, and this would seem to be the overriding view of our landscape. You know, that white settlement was all about what they could get from this land rather than really appreciation of it and engagement with it. So, you know, if we could talk a little bit more about that, can you give us the origin of that, of that quote? And
that was actually talking about what we could get from the sea, because that was a German naturalist who was out here in the 1830s, Baron von Hugel, commenting on a Scotsman who had set up down at Twofold Bay, a little bit before Ben Boyd, but only a few years before, to exploit the migrating whales up and down the coast. So they did that from the 1830s. Believe it or not, I think between 1830 and 1833, products from whaling were the biggest export from Australia, even bigger than sheep, but then sheep overtook it, and then we have, you know, various mining products after that as well. So it was never what it was in the United States. We never had the fleets that dominated the Pacific, and at Twofold Bay it was shore whaling. So his commentary was, these people are down there and they're living this harsh life because the chap he's referring to is living in a bark hut, incidentally with a little library of 100 books that he'd taken there with him, so he's not a complete Philistine, but was willing to put up with that harsh life just to set up an industry and to make as much money as he could quickly. Whether it reflected the mentality of that chap, whose name's just gone out of my head at the moment, but I'll quickly look through the book and remember it. It certainly did Ben Boyd, who came after him and who is known to some of you at least as the person who introduced blackbirding to Australia, I think, which is taking people from Vanuatu and places without their consent. You know, it's a sort of a version of slavery. Ben Boyd Road is named after him, just across the water there, because he had a wool washing works at the bottom. But he had his own bank to finance his business, and not surprisingly, it all fell in a heap by 1850. The very sort of echoes is not the right word, but anticipating the 1980s very much, and a fleet of 3 steamers, 1,000 acres or 1,000,000 acres or something like that in the Monero sheep, and then his whaling works at Twofold Bay, which was all about whaling and just, you know, intensive exploitation.
Is it still true of the coast? I mean, are we still just looking at ways of exploiting it, getting the buck quickly from it? You know, getting rich from that is because of the development and.
Well, I suppose the equivalent of Weipa and bauxite is sand mining through the post-war years along New South Wales, which many people are shocked by because it upsets the beaches that we love so much and turns them into mining sites. That came and went as an issue, and now what's foremost in people's mind is overdevelopment. So, you know, we're loving the coast to death, and we're just buying up every little patch of land and, you know, changing it
literally to death. I heard a slightly disturbing phrase last night, which was that contemporary capitalism is engaged in environmental necrophilia. I'm just going to leave that image with you all and just unpack that yourselves. But yes, that idea that, you know, I love this and so I must destroy it. Whilst, literally loving it to death because I can get something from it.
We're not unique in that. I mean, as tourists, as first world tourists, we go and we're always discovering the next best place, the place that's never been discovered, where you can experience authentic Indigenous culture, and you're the spearhead of what comes forward. I've been part of that in Thailand. I thought I found the next best place, and I don't want to go back there because I know it's no longer what it was, and I was part of that thin edge of the wedge. But that's the situation up and down the coast. There's still a lot of coast, I mean, and that's reflective both of what a small population we've had historically and what an extraordinary coastline we have, and how we didn't pay it attention for so long. You know, so in New South Wales, at any rate, I can't really comment on the other states, but we only really started building holiday houses from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, and these are small fibro places for the most part. Big patches of land bought up by real estate agents, but sold off piecemeal at the wrong time because of the depression in the 1930s, and it really doesn't take off to what we understand as overdevelopment until the 1980s and 90s, and it's city money then, and anywhere within a 3-hour ring of Sydney or Canberra or Brisbane on the far north coast is easy game for big city money.
Yeah. Well, when I was a kid, we went for our summer holidays to Bluey's Beach up near Foster, and you know, Bluey's Beach then wasn't the way it is now, but there's a point of that. And you know, when our parents sent us down to the beach to play all day in the sun without a hat on, one of the things, you didn't have to worry about sun, and one of the things they said was just watch out for the dredge, stay clear of the dredge. And you know, Bluey's Beach had this monster-like machine in the middle of it with the black sands, the mineral sands it was mining spread around, and the middle of the beach was kind of dredged out, and a channel had been built. And you know, looking back, it's almost like a dream. It's like, did that really happen? Could Bluey's Beach have been a mining site? Were we taken for our holidays to a mining site?
Yes.
Which, of course, my dad worked connected with the mining industry, and he was perfectly happy to take us to a mining site. Sometimes literally, we went to mining sites for sightseeing, but that wasn't why.
Hopefully not Wishmoon.
We went to Bluey's, but you know, the mineral sands business went into decline for the normal reasons it goes into decline in mining, which is a fall in the price and the demand for the product. And generally, mines are revived when the price revives, and you know, you see that throughout Australia. I suspect that is not going to happen at Bluey's Beach if the price of you know, rutile and you know, titanium and things like that shoots up again, because the sand of such beaches becomes economic once more. And what will have protected it is that it's been loved so much that it's turned into a kind of, you know, double bay on the north coast, and so that you know, one form of exploitation has cancelled out the other.
It's interesting, isn't it? Tell us truly though, Malcolm, what is the effect on our landscape of mining? I mean, it happens underground. We don't see it. It's not in the middle of Bluey's Beach, so we're not aware of it really. It's just a notional thing that happens out there. Very few of us are prepared to give up all the benefits and the products that we use, you know, that come from mining. what is the, you've done so much research for this book.
It's hard to answer your question concisely because there are,
Take your time. Take a few minutes. I think we're interested.
There's such a long history, and when you're comparing, say, uranium mining with iron ore mining, the two things are not comparable because uranium mining can leave, can lay waste to land forever. We were taken on a holiday to Tasmania as kids, where Dad took us to Mount Lyell, to look at the open cut mine there was indistinguishable from the surrounding countryside, because Mount Lyell and Mount Owen had been turned yellow and bare into a moonscape by the results of 100 years of mining. And that was quite a shocking thing to see. But at the same time, as young boys, my brother and I were almost in awe of it. Wow,
Your dad really clearly did take you on holidays to the sort of minor.
No wonder you wrote this book. Now we understand.
That's a different session. But at the same time, you thinking, wow, what man can do. It's frightening and it's horrible, but it's exciting. It's immense. You compare that with iron ore mining, and by far the dominant mining industry in Australia today is iron ore in Western Australia, and there are not the same environmental results. Iron ore mining is an earth-moving operation. It is a matter of digging up dirt. There's not the processing that goes on. There's not the injection of poisons into the environment, or the release of poisons into the environment from the product itself. Nowadays, there are stipulations on mining companies to by cubic metre to replace the dirt that they take out, and to effect remediation of the landscape. And to be honest, in those parts of Western Australia, the remediation work they've done in desert country is in some way, you hate to say it, but it's a credit to the mining companies that they have spent a lot of money making good the land that they have left. Now, of course, it's not making it pristine, but it is making good. Where it kind of hits you emotionally, and I think that's probably where your argument is leading, is when you follow that dirt, as I did researching this book, you follow it, by the train line, 200 odd kilometres from the mines in the Pilbara to the ports, where it goes into the big stockpiles that you see on TV with those reclaimers that scoop it out and put it onto other trains that feed out along these immense jetties to the waiting ships. Just one company, Rio Tinto, Australia's biggest iron ore miner, is sending out now close to 400 million tonnes a year, which is 8 million tonnes a week, which is 1.2 million tonnes a day, which is 50,000 tonnes every hour. And it can be measured like that because it happens 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, even on Good Friday, even on Christmas Day. It's just pouring out. And when you stand there at the last link in that chain and, you're watching the dirt just pour into these boats, and it'll only pause for another boat, and there are many of them, to pull in and open its guts up. You sort of watch it going on and on and on, and you think, is there going to be any of Australia left? Is the whole continent going to end up in China?
Just collapse.
When
and of course it's not, but everybody I've spoken to who's been there for the first time has a similar emotional reaction to that. Is Australia actually being picked up and moved off somewhere else? It really hits you in the guts.
As you're describing it, it is like that sort of feeling of being physically torn, isn't it? That sort of the sense of being cut.
Yeah.
But when you said, I'm really stuck on this, when you said there is a sort of a replacement of kind of cubic metre for cubic metre, where is the replacement coming from?
Oh,
Are we just sort of moving around bits of...
Yeah, Yeah,
But if it's
coming
gone-
but it's dirt. It's dirt being replaced by other dirt. So it's
But
dirt.
where's the other dirt coming
Australian
from?
dirt. Other Australian dirt.
Yeah.
China.
The other dirt will be coming
Anyone
from.
else struggling with the maths?
The other dirt will be coming from 500 metres away.
Right, but-
so it's dirt
So
that's been
something else
tested.
is still losing. There's
Not-
still a loss. Let's not pretend
Well,
there's not a loss.
Well, exactly. But in terms of, if you do the maths, it's obviously absurd to think that
Yeah.
Australia is going to end up in China.
No.
But even on the scale of a single mine, it's a big country. There's plenty of dirt to go around, and they plant trees on it. And,
That's a largely uninhabited landscape, would I be right
Yes,
in saying that?
yes,
Yeah. So,
yeah.
but in the Hunter Valley, I mean, on Facebook, you'd be seeing those images of those open cut mines there,
Yeah.
and with the people who are protesting because they've got farms nearby. Often the juxtaposition of really beautiful farmland, pastoral land, productive land in a different sense, which tugs at my heartstrings. But I know that that's also very much a transformed landscape. It has its own beauty, and because I know it's a transformed landscape, it's full of dilemmas and angst. I experienced those recently up at Armidale and in New England, and just breathtakingly beautiful. But realising
All
this
cleared.
and reading Judith Wright, and it was so interesting. But I'm just wondering how they'll remediate that and what that will turn into. I mean, if it's all planted with trees, perhaps you won't notice the
well,
huge new hills or valleys.
this is this kind of tension within Australia. Going back to Glover, we've had painters throughout who've painted not untamed wild Australian land. They've painted cleared fields, and so farmers, pastoralists can create something beautiful as they exploit the land, because in our European formed
Sensibility.
ideas of beauty, nobody's been painting open cut coal mines, and it's interesting that the beauty argument does come into it, and when you hear farmers from New South Wales and Queensland talk about and coal seam gas and so on, it's an aesthetic argument. As much as an economic
But it's an
argument, all the other
inauthentic aesthetics,
arguments.
as you say, isn't it? I mean,
It's
that
fundamentally
European
inauthentic,
landscape
yeah.
is that we think of as the sort of beautiful, green hills
But it's
are
an
grazed.
it's an authentic aesthetic appreciation. I mean, me as one who loves some of that landscape, that's true. I really think it's beautiful. I'm wondering when that land is remediated, whenever that happens up in the Hunter Valley and they stop mining coal up there, whether that could be turned into a beautiful landscape, and 200-300 years down the track we will have forgotten about the mine that was there, because look at this magnificent valley, with all those trees.
Yeah, well, it's possible it would probably take that long, and that's what you see in Tasmania. It's still, the real guts of the mining down at Mount Lyell stopped 35 years ago. It's still been mined since then, but the repair of the landscape is a long way from completion.
Malcolm, you were right. We could talk the whole session just on the environmental impacts. But I just wanted, in your book, Kathryn, too, there's this real sense of Armageddon. There's a sense of we have caused this flood. Do you want to just talk a minute about trying to capture that? And because religion is a very big part of this, and we'll get to the next question in a minute where we talk politics and religion, but were you trying to capture that sense of Armageddon or the Great Flood, or, was there something, the impact we have?
I think Ian's beautiful optimism aside, that it's all going to...
No, I'm just throwing that out there.
But I think there's always that tension, isn't there, between... I feel that there is a sense at the moment of, not quite of Armageddon, but a great concern about what our impact is on the environment. And I certainly didn't... Of course, Floodline is read by some people as a climate change novel. I didn't set out to write a climate change novel. It was a sort of myth that worked for me. But because the people travelling through that landscape are people who have that idea of cause and effect, we behave in a certain way, we impact on each other in a certain way. I think I think as a novelist, it's part of my job to think about causality, I suppose, and I don't mean in a political sense, but that idea of there's nothing that has no impact. So it's not, I'm very wary of the idea that, yes, it's an Armageddon novel. It's not the end of time, but we are in a time, I think, that I think fiction writers as well as non-fiction writers have to address, which is that our impact, because we are bigger in number, we are many, and our resources, our technology, all of that is so much bigger. So actually we impact on the environment differently, significantly, and we have to do something with that. We have to engage with that. We have to think about it imaginatively and practically.
I think what you all do in different ways is make us think as readers about, the ethical and moral decisions that we're making constantly when we're watching what is happening to the environments around us. And I just want to, of course, we could talk forever about what's been pillaged from the marine life too, and what's been destroyed, and of course, lately with marine parks, things that are coming back. You told us a lovely little story just before the session. We were talking about sharks. I was talking about the metaphoric link of sharks, if you like, the mining sharks and the sharks literally at the coast, and, the religious sharks that come up in Kathryn's book. Do you just want to talk a little bit about the different way the sharks are dealt with and that story recently?
Well, the shark attack at Tarthrop in a month or so ago, it just struck me, looking at the coverage of that, how dignified and philosophical is the right word, but the approach was to that, even on the part of the husband who lost his wife suddenly in that morning. And there's apparently no anger. She was doing what she did every morning, and that's a risk you take. And that seemed to me a new attitude. We're in someone else's environment, we respect it, we're no longer dominating that, and the shark takes us, and we've got to accept that. There's certainly sadness and grief and all the rest, and it's very different to the attitude in the West, and clearly not everyone believes this because there have been many protests in the West where they're drumline catching sharks and trying to hunt down and not even getting the great white that apparently killed the people over there, or the last of the shark attack. So that's sort of an old attitude, and Tim Winton has written very eloquently about that and passionately. But the more recent Tartar episode was a new attitude, and that's very interesting. And sharks, of all things, I can see this evolution because going back to the whaling story, there we were. A whale came into Sydney Harbour in 1792, and all the white fellas could think about was chasing it in the boat and spearing it. They were just hopped in, they wanted to do, because that's what you do to a whale. Whales get transformed in the imagination by the end of the 60s. We stopped whaling, I think, in 1979. And now whales and dolphins are like nature's soul surfers. That's one term I use in the book. And they're up there at Byron Bay, and we watch them and we revere them. That's a very dramatic shift within a generation. Goodness me, they were whaling offshore at the 1920s in Twofold Bay still. And Byron Bay in 1965.
Yeah, I declare I come from Byron.
And now we're doing it with sharks. So that's a positive thing. We are sort of getting a little bit of humility about us. That's
there has been a shift, I notice, that other people might notice too, I mean, there is on one hand, and it's interesting you say that in the West there's still that kind of kill them, kill them.
Because there's a lot of protests in the West
too.
Yes,
there's that too.
It's not an East-West thing by any means.
Yeah.
And Tim Winton lives in the West.
That's true. That's true. But that kind of, there is all of that, cull, kill. But alongside that, there's a sort of shift, I notice, of diving with sharks, lots of slightly dodgy YouTube videos of people free diving and hugging sharks. So I wonder that idea of that shift with the whale and the dolphin, whether there's some desire to make sharks the next soul
There's a
surface.
fabulous Byron Bay comedian who makes a joke that when people say, the dolphins came and swam with me, and she said, well, when they come and walk with you on the land, then I'll be impressed. Malcolm, can we go to the politics, the current politics around mining? And I know that I'm just eating into your question time a little, but I just want to know, speaking of it being so deep in our DNA, mining is huge in our politics at the moment. Can you explain that to us?
Well, part of the reason I started writing this book was this question of, it was at the time when the mining tax was first proposed. Why does this not have 90% public support? This is, it's beyond making sense. It is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
And yet the public response, with the exception of everybody you know,
Self-selecting group.
everybody else, in a profound sense, seemed to take. I don't think they were taking the side of Andrew Forrest or Gina Rinehart, and when it came to spending on the advertising campaigns, they were not brainwashed. The government spent much more money in support of the mining tax than the miners spent in opposition to it. And yet the fallout of it was the beginning of the end of that Labor government. Why was that? And I kind of float the hypothesis that there is in the Australian character something, kind of a basic fondness for mining and opposition to taxation, which you can take back to Eureka, and a kind of a respect for the earthiness, and I don't. It's impossible to draw any conclusions about national character anyway, but it's sort of worth flying that kite to test it out, and I don't come to any conclusions on it, but it's a question worth asking, and miners can always say to us, and particularly miners of things like coal and iron ore, they will say, well, okay, you may not like it, you may hate it, but you're not going to. If we remove, exactly. It's not like vegetarianism where you can take a stand against the killing of animals for food and not eat them. It's simply not an option with mining. So, we're strung across this barrel by this industry that we depend on, and I think that at some level informs the politics around it.
So maybe it's about what we do best with their profits rather than, and that gets back to the tax idea, and again, everybody you talk to, they've heard about the Norway model now, and the great nest egg that a country can build from windfall profits from mining, and yet Australia didn't do it. And part of it is that sort of imagery of the, blue singleted man. And of course, and again, what I take from your book is huge wages that are being paid, that contribute to some degree to them going with their bosses. There's no unified Australian labour history, in partly because of mining, partly because the workers' paradise of Broken Hill actually split from the whole Australian union movement and had its own conciliation arbitration commission. Focus on Broken Hill, because fundamentally in Broken Hill, as in Mount Isa, as in many other parts of Australia, and now you can say in the Pilbara, there is a level at which the workers find common cause with their employers to be greater than their common cause with other workers. And just briefly before I hand over, the politics of the coast, of course, too, the coastal development, at the moment it's quite important too and big. Would you like to talk to that? Just about how, those developers are also protected, if you like, politically?
Well, I think I'm right in thinking Tweed Council was dismissed in 2005 after the beginning of a lot of development up there. So, money talks. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, and when I went up there to look at those big developments, Casuarina Salt, I think there's another one called Seaside, the billboards are there saying, realise your dream. I mean, this is your dream. So we're complicit in the mining industry, and they're sort of making us complicit.
And at the same time, the Greens, of course, are on the are using the coast to fight their arguments too. So
indeed, yeah. And I mean, one of the issues I found most difficult to get my head around was marine parks, because it is so much about science, and I'm not a scientist. And you've got one fisheries biologist arguing against a marine biologist, about the value of marine parks and whether the science has been proved, and because those debates were so contentious, you end up with all these bumper stickers saying there's no science to marine parks. It gets distilled down into a slogan at the end. And I thought, no, it's not that black and white. You know, it's very, very interesting.
We could talk forever about slogans, and but just very, very quickly, religion is having a big impact at the moment too, politically.
Look, I think, well, it is right now, isn't it? You know, and I think when you have a worldview that says we, as a species, are, you know, specially created and specially chosen, and the world, there are different views in religion. In Christian religion, there's the we are stewards of creation angle, and then there's the we own all this stuff and we can do what the hell we like angle.
We've got about 7 minutes left. Question, straight up, just in case people didn't hear. It was just about the sharpness. Do you see the landscape more sharply when you're away from it than within it?
Yeah. I think that writing, well, that the imagination becomes, or appears to become richer in absence. Grief makes things sharper when we remember someone who we've lost. We remember certain things with sharper detail. You know, the shape of a nose, but then the rest is all sort of vague. Like there's a sort of a sharp nose and then the sort of wobbly person because it's been 10 years. For me, I think the landscape memory became a bit like that writing out of longing, well, as I said, it became a sort of sensory memory, certain smells, certain sounds, that I think everyone, you know, everyone who lives in Australia will respond to. I was listening to the call of the magpie the other day and just thought, oh, I'm so glad that even in Balmain I have that little noise, you know. Or if you hear is it the whitbird? Is that the whitbird?
Good impression.
Thank you very much.
And the man just here. The gentleman first. Oh, okay. You can argue it out.
For Malcolm about, I'm very critical about this idea of rehabilitation of mining sites. I lived in Singleton and taught there. And I drove many times past a rehabilitation site that had proudly on it 1971 rehabilitated site, and it looked as barren as the field of Mars. And what I know from living in those communities was that it had the highest asthma rates, very high mental illness, extremely high wages. All my talented boys left high school at year 10 because they followed Dad down the mine. Did you look at any of the impacts post the mine?
So this is about social impacts post the mining. Yeah,
and lead in the still. I think they might have just finished cleaning the lead dust out of the roofs of cottages in Broken Hill from 100 years ago, and you know, Lithgow is a great example. You know, what can be said as somebody writing history is that the first point to make is that the mining industry hadn't heard of the environment until about 1970. They didn't know what the environment was. And if a mine left behind a waste, then too bad. The mine was just moving on to somewhere else. So in the overall sweep of time, what you're talking about is an industry that only became aware through political pressure and through the effects that mines had on local communities, aware of the problem very, very recently, and began addressing a problem that is going to take decades, if not hundreds of years to remediate. So, you know, as you know, the Chinese say about the French Revolution, what are the effects? It's too soon to tell. And it's probably too soon to answer your question, because both the negative effects of those mines and the remedial effects of what has been done in some cases, and you know, the industry is so diverse that you can't really talk about it as an industry. The effects are going to take generations to become clear, and so the story will take that long to be told. Mm-hmm. I'm not a mining industry worker, or you know, a mining lobbyist or anything like that. And I'm sure if you talk to one of them, they'll give you evidence to support what they are attempting to do. You know, which you treat with the appropriate scepticism.
And the gentleman next to you.
I really enjoyed your talk today. What I'm really interested in this question to the entire panel is, you've all talked about the ambiguation of how we regard the landscape, so that we have an ambiguous attitude towards it. To the extent that we are beings in that landscape, my question is twofold, I guess. To what extent is that an Australian phenomenon, and to what extent does that inform our national character?
Good. So, you know, the landscape, is it about Australia only, or has it happened elsewhere, this sense of the impact on us, and how does it form our character? Hopefully we touched on it a little bit, but just expand on that a little bit more. Kathryn, do you want to?
Just really briefly, I did a master's thesis on the impact of language and of landscape on sort of language development and physical development, and that was in Yorkshire. And, you know, people in Yorkshire are very impacted by their physical landscape. People in Scotland are incredibly impacted and connected to. And, in fact, use the word, I lived in Scotland for a long time, and you don't say, do you come from this place? You say, do you belong to? Do you belong to Paisley? Do you belong to Glasgow? Which are, you know, they're Australian standards 5 seconds away. They're completely different places. So I think that is actually universal. I think our sense of being connected in some way to where we stand and being influenced by it physically, how we speak and how we move, and that impact on the body forms us. I think we are so formed by our physical selves.
Ian, would you like to respond to that one too?
Yeah, so I'm sure all over the world people are, identify themselves with their particular landscape. I'm just wondering, and just throw this idea in quickly, that because there's so much land here and so few people historically, we think of landscape as a place empty of people and empty of buildings, and elsewhere architecture and what is obviously a cultural landscape will be what people identify with. I find that very interesting. I'm very interested in architecture and design and style, and I relate to landscapes that I see have been transformed, you know, and again, there's a melancholy and an ambiguity about thinking about the history of all that. And I can't stop stopping on the side of the road and photographing timber houses that are about to fall over, you know, before someone's got to do it before it goes. But there doesn't seem to be as much respect in Australia for the built environment and its history, however short that might be, as there are in some other places. In France, for instance, where, you know, subsidies are there to maintain certain practices and lifestyles and buildings and all the rest to maintain a cultural landscape. So that's an idea, perhaps.
I'm really sorry to the gentleman at the back. I've been given the no. I can't do it. I'm sorry. Maybe you can ask when they're signing books. Thank you all for attending and for coming along. But would you join me, please, in thanking these three fabulous writers?